My father stood at the head table at my wedding dinner, tapped his fork against his crystal glass, and waited for the room to quiet like he owned it. Then he smiled, that polished, boardroom smile, and told 200 guests that I had chosen poverty over power, that I was no longer his daughter, that I was officially removed from his will. "You'll come crawling back," he said into the microphone like it was a forecast. I felt my breathing slow instead of shatter. I took my husband's hand under the table and whispered, "It's time." And for the first time in my life, I watched my father's smile falter as his fingers tightened around the podium for balance. "My name is Alexandra Whitmore. I'm 29. I wasn't surprised he did it. That's the part people don't understand. I grew up in a house where affection was conditional and success was measurable. Everything had numbers attached to it. Square footage, market value, net worth. Even vacations weren't about rest, they were about who else would be there and what alliances might be formed over wine. My father didn't just love money, he respected it. He trusted it. He believed it told the truth about people. From the time I was old enough to sit quietly at one of his dinner parties, I understood that I was part of something strategic. I wasn't just his daughter. I was potential leverage. I remember the way he would rest his hand lightly on my shoulder while introducing me to investors or partners, not possessive, not tender. Presentational. Like I was a future asset with compound interest. He had a plan for me before I understood what planning meant. The right schools, the right internships, the right social circles, and eventually the right husband. He never phrased it crudely. That would have required acknowledging it out loud. Instead, it came in polished statements. Marriage, he used to say, should expand influence. A union should strengthen position. He once told me casually, while reviewing something on his tablet, that love was a luxury for people without leverage. People who didn't have anything to protect. I remember nodding. I was 16. At the time, I didn't even know what defiance would look like. I just knew it wasn't allowed. If I cried about something small, he would wait until I finished and then ask me what the practical solution was. If I mentioned liking a boy in school, he would ask what his parents did. If I couldn't answer, the conversation ended there. Not angrily, just dismissed, as if feelings without strategic value were irrelevant. My mother adapted to him, my brother admired him, and I learned to adjust my emotional reactions to fit the room. I became good at reading shifts in tone, tightening my posture when he did, laughing when he laughed. Approval in our house wasn't loud, it was the absence of criticism. You earned it by aligning. There was never a dramatic threat hanging over me. No screaming ultimatums. That would have been easier to rebel against. Instead, there was expectation. The quiet understanding that I would marry someone powerful, that I would extend the family's reach, that my life would be an acquisition, not a romance. And somewhere underneath all of that, even as I went to the right schools and attended the right events, there was this small, private fear that if I ever stepped outside the outline he had drafted for me, I wouldn't just disappoint him. I would be removed. Not emotionally, structurally. Like an asset that no longer fit the portfolio. I didn't have language for that fear when I was younger. I just felt it, in the way my stomach tightened whenever I imagined bringing someone home who didn't fit the profile. In the way I rehearsed conversations in my head before speaking. So when he stood at that podium on my wedding night and announced to everyone that I was no longer his daughter in any meaningful sense, it wasn't spontaneous cruelty. It was enforcement. I met Ethan in Williamsburg. Not at a gala, not through a mutual connection with a last name that carried weight. My car had stalled on a side street after a meeting I'd taken alone, a small act of independence that felt bigger than it was. I remember standing on the sidewalk in heels that didn't belong on uneven pavement, irritated more at myself than the engine. He was under the hood before I had time to overthink leaving. Grease on his hands, calm, focused, no performance in it. When he finally looked at me, it wasn't the way men in my world usually did, calculating, assessing. It was direct, simple, like I was just there. He asked what happened. I explained. He nodded. No small talk about where I lived. No recognition flicker when I said my last name. And I noticed that. I actually waited for it. The moment where he'd connect it, shift slightly, become careful or impressed. It never came. He told me what the issue likely was, explained it without condescension, and fixed it. When I offered to pay him more than the standard rate, he didn't hesitate to refuse the excess. Not prideful, just factual. It wasn't worth that much. That's when something in me felt unfamiliar. I'd grown up around people who inflated value because they could. He didn't. We started talking after that, not in a dramatic way, coffee, walks, conversations that stretched without strategy behind them. He didn't ask what my father did. He didn't probe for connections. When I eventually told him, he shrugged slightly, like it didn't alter anything fundamental about me. He cared about what I thought, what I wanted. It sounds simple saying it now, but at the time it felt destabilizing. There was no leverage in his interest. And that terrified me more than it should have. Because the first time I imagined introducing him at one of my father's dinners, I could already see the outcome. I told my father about Ethan sooner than I planned to. I think some part of me wanted to test the collision. He didn't yell, he didn't need to. His face went still in that way it did when he was calculating damage. He asked questions. Where did he work? What was his background, his education, his family? The questions weren't about compatibility, they were about status alignment. When I said he was a mechanic from Williamsburg, my father's expression shifted, subtle but unmistakable. Disappointment first, then dismissal. He said something about phases, about distraction, about not confusing gratitude with compatibility. I didn't argue. I just kept seeing Ethan's hands steady under that hood, unconcerned with my last name. Within days, my father had hired a private investigator. I found out not because he told me directly, but because he asked very specific questions, things only someone digging could uncover. He wanted to know if Ethan had debt, a record, a hidden engagement, anything. Weeks passed. Nothing surfaced. No scandals, no secrets, just a man who worked hard, paid his bills, and lived quietly. That should have been neutral information. Instead, it angered him. I watched disbelief turn into something sharper. It wasn't that Ethan had done something wrong. It was that he hadn't. There was no flaw to expose, no weakness to weaponize. My father began speaking about him differently then, not curious, not analytical. Contemptuous. As if the absence of ambition, beyond honest work, was itself an offense. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel small under his scrutiny. I felt protective. Ethan proposed on the roof of his building in Williamsburg. There were no photographers hiding behind chimneys, no string quartet, no curated skyline moment designed for social media. It was late, the air smelled faintly like rain on concrete, and the city hummed in that steady way it does when no one important is watching. He didn't kneel immediately. He just looked at me for a long second, almost like he was measuring whether I understood what he was offering. Then he took out a small velvet box, simple, slightly worn at the edges, and opened it. The diamond wasn't enormous. It wasn't meant to be. What struck me wasn't the ring, it was his hands. They were steady. He told me he couldn't promise a certain kind of life. He could promise love, respect, partnership. And I realized, standing there in heels I hadn't meant to wear that long, that no one had ever offered me those things without conditions attached. I said yes before fear had time to reorganize itself. The fallout was immediate. My father didn't argue this time, he didn't attempt persuasion, he implemented. Within 48 hours, my credit cards stopped working. My accounts were frozen, then removed. Access revoked with sterile efficiency. I remember standing at a checkout counter, smiling politely while my card declined twice, pretending it was a bank error. It was. When I called, there was no emotional confrontation, just a factual explanation. My financial privileges were no longer active. Privileges? My mother's tone shifted too, softer, distant. She told me she hoped I understood how complicated this was for everyone. My brother stopped answering my messages altogether. Later, I saw subtle comments online about self-sabotage and romantic delusion. Not naming me, not needing to. The penthouse on the Upper East Side was no longer mine to inhabit. I packed quietly. There wasn't a dramatic eviction, just an understanding that I didn't belong there anymore. Ethan helped me move into his apartment in Williamsburg. Modest didn't even fully describe it. The kitchen barely fit 2 people at once. The floors creaked. The windows didn't mute street noise the way I was used to. I remember sitting on the edge of the bed that first night, staring at the unfamiliar ceiling and feeling the weight of the shift. Not regret, just the magnitude. I started applying for jobs almost immediately, roles I was more than qualified for, meetings that, months earlier, would have been automatic. Emails came back polite but distant, positions no longer available. Interviews rescheduled, then canceled. Doors I hadn't realized were held open. By my last name began closing with quiet finality. I didn't tell Ethan every time another rejection came through. I didn't want him to feel responsible for something that was clearly a coordinated withdrawal of support. But he noticed. He always noticed. At night, sometimes, his phone would ring. He would step into the other room to take the call. His voice would lower, focus sharpen. The language he used wasn't mechanical. It wasn't about cars or parts or repairs. It was measured, strategic. When I asked casually who it was, he would answer calmly. Work, things he was handling. I believed him. But I also began to understand that the man I had chosen was more layered than I had initially seen. And while my father was stripping my life down to its structural bones, Ethan remained steady beside me, unshaken, almost prepared. That contrast made everything feel unstable. It was exactly 1 week before the wedding when he tried to buy me off. I had thought, in some naive corner of my mind, that perhaps he would eventually accept it, that maybe, just maybe, he would let me make my own choice without interference. But that illusion shattered over the course of 1 phone call and 2 meetings. The first offer came as a carefully worded proposition, $4 million to cancel the wedding. Not "I'm proud of you," not "I hope you're happy." Just money, delivered with the sterile precision of a boardroom negotiation. I remember staring at the ceiling as my phone buzzed, the amount blinking back at me like a taunt. My fingers were shaking slightly, and for a fleeting second, a whisper of doubt flitted through me. $4 million could solve everything. My apartment, my fledgling attempts at independence, the creeping anxiety of professional rejection. I didn't answer immediately. When I finally did, I said what I knew I had to know. The pause on the other end was telling. Then the tone shifted. Subtle at first, a sigh, a suggestion that perhaps I was being short-sighted, but it escalated quickly into sharpness, into disbelief, into an almost personal insult disguised as rational persuasion. "Do you really think you can manage on your own?" he asked. His voice had that familiar edge now, the one that always hinted I was failing even when I was merely existing. "You're throwing away everything for a working man." I clenched my jaw and held the phone tighter. 4 million became 9 in the next breath. 9. He doubled the offer, and the language changed from coaxing to command. Implications seeped into every word. I was no longer being asked. I was being tested, mocked, challenged. "You're choosing poverty over legacy," he said finally, each word deliberate, polished like a dagger. I remember standing by the window, the city lights of Williamsburg glowing faintly against the apartment walls, and breathing through the surge of panic and frustration. For a moment, the fight felt heavier than I could carry. I felt the old weight of his expectations, the echo of every dinner party, every silent judgment, every lesson drilled into me about leverage and value. But then I looked at Ethan. He was calm, unshaken, steady in a way that reminded me why I had chosen this, why I had said yes. And just like that, the fleeting tremor of doubt solidified into resolve. I wasn't for sale. I wasn't negotiable, not for any sum of money, not for any fear, guilt, or implication that my life had a price tag. I refused again, firmly this time, quietly, but unmistakably. And in that refusal, something broke not in me, but in the weight I had carried all those years. The burden of expectation, the ghost of a plan that wasn't mine, the subtle fear of defiance, it fractured. I cried a little that night, quietly in the kitchen while Ethan washed dishes, not from regret, from the release of holding everything in for so long. And when I finally stepped out of the bathroom, my certainty had hardened. Whatever came next, humiliation, disownment, financial exile, I knew I would not step back. I was choosing a different kind of power. The ballroom smelled faintly of roses and expensive perfume, but that sweetness didn't mask the tension that had tightened like a cord in my chest. 200 uninvited guests milled quietly among the tables, smiling politely at servers while their eyes kept flicking toward the head table where my father sat, smug and composed, as if he had orchestrated the entire room like a stage play. The air felt suffocating. Every polite nod from someone I barely knew pressed down on me like another reminder that he was watching, evaluating, judging. He tapped his glass for attention. The room went silent in that automatic, conditioned way that comes when a Whitmore is present. I felt the metallic scrape of the microphone against the stand before he spoke. And then he smiled, the kind of smile I had seen on corporate deal days, practiced, deliberate, void of warmth. "I have an announcement regarding my daughter," he said, letting the words hover, sharp as glass. "She has chosen to reject everything our family has built. She has chosen a working man from Williamsburg." A murmur went through the room. The phrase felt like a physical blow. I felt my shoulders tense, my fingers grip the edge of the table. I wanted to shrink, to disappear into the fabric of the banquet chair, but I didn't. Not this time. "You will understand that Alexandra is no longer considered my daughter," he continued. "She is removed from any claim to my estate. Every asset, every opportunity she had access to gone." I felt the weight of the statement settle over me like lead, but beneath the fear and sting, clarity came. The years of conditioning, the subtle dread of disobedience, the quiet, constant expectation of compliance, it all fell into place. This was not about punishment alone. It was about control, about entitlement, about demonstrating to everyone present that deviation had a cost. The room shifted. Some faces stiffened, others looked down at their plates, pretending to occupy themselves with silverware. A few whispered under their breaths. I caught the fleeting glance of a cousin, eyes wide with discomfort, and it almost made me smile. I exhaled, slow and deliberate, letting the silence stretch. Then I turned slightly toward Ethan, squeezed his hand under the table, and whispered, "It's time." The words were small, intimate, yet charged, and in that moment, I found the courage to speak to the room. My voice was calm but carried, steady despite the tremor I felt inside. "I have chosen love," I said, meeting the eyes of those who watched, over power, over money, over fear. "And if choosing to be loved costs me everything else, then it is a price I am willing to pay." The murmurs changed. A few gasps, yes, but there were nods too, quiet acknowledgments from people who understood, even if only for a fraction of a second, what it meant to claim your life. My father's hand tightened on the podium. His entitlement was visible now in the slight curve of his mouth, the rigid line of his jaw, the way he shifted his weight as if to steady himself. But I did not falter. I would not falter. And just like that, the head table's polished veneer of control began to crack. The days after the wedding were quiet, but heavy. Not the peaceful kind of quiet that follows a ceremony, but a suffocating silence that carried the echoes of my father's words, the murmurs of the uninvited guests, the weight of everyone watching what I had done. Professionally, the fallout was immediate. Doors that had once opened smoothly were now slammed shut. Emails went unanswered. Job offers evaporated in polite refusals. The world I had taken for granted suddenly felt like it had been re-engineered to exclude me. My mother reached out a few times, voice soft, coaxing, almost pleading. She wanted to convince me that I had made a mistake, that Ethan and I could somehow step back and restore the family equilibrium. I listened, nodded, even feigned consideration for a moment, but inside, I felt a quiet, growing resolve. I had anticipated her tone, the same careful, calculated voice that had allowed her to navigate my father's control for decades. But this time, I wasn't playing the part. My brother, on the other hand, took a more public approach. Screenshots, comments, subtle jabs about my new apartment, my lifestyle, the choice I had made. It stung differently than my father's disapproval. It was small, petty, and deliberate, a modern echo of the subtle control that had shaped my childhood. I remember scrolling through one post late at night, shoulders tight, fists clenched, trying to swallow the mix of anger and disbelief that a family could weaponize social media with such ease. 4 months after the wedding, a formal notice arrived. Not a conversation, not a call. A crisp, professional letter detailing the permanent removal of any claim I had to my father's estate, a $175 million inheritance, gone with the stroke of a pen. I remember holding the envelope in the kitchen of our Williamsburg apartment, shaking slightly, staring at the printed words as though reading them aloud might make them less real. The words were brutal in their precision. There was no negotiation, no conditional clause, no space for appeal. It was final. I sank into a chair, the reality of the financial exile pressing against me. Everything I had known, everything I had been trained to value, was stripped away. And yet, alongside the panic and disbelief, there was also a strange clarity. This was the cost of choice, the consequence of defiance, and, oddly, the beginning of something that felt like freedom. Ethan noticed my stillness, the tight line of my jaw. He sat across from me, hands folded, voice calm but firm. "Trust me," he said. 3 months, just 3 months, and you'll understand why we're here." I wanted to ask, to demand clarity, to unravel the mystery I sensed in his late-night calls and measured actions. But I didn't. I looked at him and saw steadiness, a quiet authority that felt like an anchor in the storm of my disowned life. For the first time since my father's words at the wedding, I let myself lean into that trust. I nodded. 3 months. I could wait 3 months. And as I exhaled slowly, I realized that although the world I had grown up in had pushed me out, another one built on partnership and respect, was quietly beginning to take shape. I remember the day I decided to open Meridian Creative like it was a quiet rebellion against the life my father had mapped out for me. I used a portion of my grandmother's trust fund money that came with no expectations, no hidden agendas, no strings attached, to rent a small office space in Williamsburg. The walls were bare, the paint slightly chipped, the floorboards creaking under my heels as I paced back and forth, mentally sketching the vision I wanted. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't the penthouse boardroom where I had once made decisions on a whim. But it was mine, and for the first time in months, the word felt tangible. The grind was slow, painfully slow. I spent mornings pitching ideas to small businesses, afternoons designing marketing plans on a laptop that had seen better days, nights cold calling potential clients and revising proposals until my eyes blurred. Every no stung, every delayed response threatened to make me question whether this was possible. But with Ethan beside me, calm and patient, I kept moving. He didn't solve problems for me. He simply reminded me that we could solve them together. That partnership was something tangible, something that could outlast my father's disapproval. Reclaiming my identity was a more subtle process. I had to learn to value my own judgment, trust my instincts, and accept that failure didn't mean worthlessness. There were nights when I stared at the blank spreadsheet on my computer screen and thought, maybe I can't do this. And then I would remember the steady confidence in Ethan's eyes, the way he had never questioned my choice, and I would take a breath, start again. Meridian Creative didn't explode overnight, but small victories began to arrive. A local boutique signed on for a seasonal campaign, impressed by the detailed research I had compiled. A tech startup asked for a complete rebranding proposal, fascinated by the creative narrative I had pitched. Each little win, each contract that bore my signature, became proof that I could succeed on my own terms. It was different from inherited success, raw, earned, and undeniably mine. Slowly, the momentum built. I began to assemble a small team, people who shared the vision, who believed in a company led by passion rather than entitlement. I realized that this was more than just a business. It was a declaration. Meridian Creative was the tangible manifestation of autonomy, proof that I didn't need to be tethered to my father's wealth or approval to create something meaningful. I would stay late into the evenings, sipping lukewarm coffee, sketching ideas on sticky notes plastered across the office walls, listening to the distant hum of Williamsburg nightlife seeping through the windows. Every phone call that ended with a signed contract felt like a small, quiet victory over the past months of rejection, humiliation, and exile. For the first time since my wedding, I felt the shift, the sense that I was no longer merely reacting to the forces that had tried to control me. I was creating. I was moving forward. Meridian Creative was slow to grow, yes, but it was mine. Every ounce of progress was a reminder that worth could be self-defined, that success could be earned with grit, perseverance, and the quiet insistence to keep going when the world expected me to falter. It was a late Thursday afternoon when the email arrived from Nexus AI. At first, I thought it was just another routine inquiry, perhaps a small contract, a minor consultation. But as I skimmed the details, my pulse quickened. They were looking for a marketing partner for a $45 million data center project, one that, by name and scope, mirrored the very development my father had been aggressively pursuing before I had walked away. The coincidence was uncanny. I felt the hairs on my arms prickling, a mix of anxiety and anticipation twisting in my stomach. I read and reread the proposal, my mind racing through the implications. This wasn't just a client lead. This was a thread leading directly to something bigger. Something I couldn't yet name. The address of their headquarters, the project brief, the tone of the correspondence, all of it suggested a company with the capacity to dwarf my fledgling firm, yet the way they addressed me personally felt intentional, as though someone already knew the work I'd been quietly building. Later that evening, Ethan approached me, holding a small envelope in his hand. His expression was calm, unreadable, but the intensity in his eyes made me pause mid-step. "You're going to want to see this," he said softly. Inside was a VIP invitation to the Tech Innovation Gala, a high-profile event where the biggest players in tech, finance, and media would converge. It wasn't just a gala. It was the kind of stage where fortunes were announced, partnerships forged, and reputations solidified. I turned the invitation over and over, feeling the weight of it, both in the paper and in the possibilities it represented. "You think I should go?" I asked, suspicion lacing my tone. It wasn't just the gala itself. It was Ethan handing it to me, the timing, the way he seemed to know more than he was saying. He gave a small, steady smile. "I think you need to see it for yourself. Just trust me." That trust, once so easily given, now carried a tension I hadn't anticipated. The late-night calls, the carefully guarded information, the calm authority with which he navigated challenges, all of it converged in this moment. Something significant was coming, something that could shift everything, and I had a front-row seat. I set the invitation down on the kitchen counter, staring at it under the soft glow of the pendant lights. I could feel the shift beneath my skin, a mixture of suspense and incredulity. Nexus AI reaching out, the gala, Ethan's deliberate handoff. The pieces were starting to click, but not yet fully. My father's influence, my own fledgling independence, and this mysterious opportunity were colliding in ways I hadn't yet fully comprehended. I took a deep breath and let myself lean back into the tension rather than fight it. The invitation was more than a card, it was a signal. And deep down, I knew that the answers and the reckoning with my father were about to arrive. The gala hall shimmered under crystal chandeliers, the kind of light that made every polished surface gleam and every tailored suit look sharper. We arrived together, Ethan and I, side by side, and I felt the familiar tug of tension as soon as we stepped through the grand entrance. The room was a mosaic of the city's elite, investors, CEOs, tech visionaries, all nodding, laughing, networking with a practiced ease that felt both exhilarating and suffocating. Before the introductions could fully settle, I caught my father's sharp, calculating gaze across the room. He stepped forward as if compelled to reassert his superiority, lips curling into that thin, confident line he always wore when he thought he was in control. "Ah," he said loud enough for a few nearby acquaintances to hear, "and this must be the help you've been talking about. The working man from Williamsburg." His words carried that same familiar mixture of condescension and entitlement, meant to belittle, to puncture the space Ethan occupied beside me. Ethan didn't flinch. He simply gave a subtle nod and allowed my father's remark to hang in the air. The tension tightened, and I felt the pressure coil in my chest, familiar but no longer paralyzing. I had learned to hold space for my own courage, and now I was about to witness what that meant in real time. The announcer took the stage, voice resonant, commanding attention. "And now, ladies and gentlemen, the CEO of Nexus AI." The pause was deliberate, drawing every gaze toward the podium. "Ethan Caldwell." The room erupted. Murmurs turned into audible gasps, heads swiveled, and the clinking of champagne glasses stilled as recognition rippled through the crowd. I watched my father's face shift in real time, first disbelief, then shock, then the rapid unraveling of control. His jaw tightened, eyes narrowing as the room collectively absorbed the revelation. Ethan walked forward, composed, every step deliberate. He ascended the stage with a calm authority that contrasted sharply with my father's crumbling posture at the edge of the room. When he began to speak, introducing strategic plans, innovative expansions, and partnerships, it wasn't just a speech, it was an announcement of dominance. Every word, precise and confident, solidified a shift that was palpable in the room. The social hierarchy my father had clung to so tightly was quietly, and then undeniably, overturned. I could see the subtle tremor in my father's hand as he gripped the arm of a chair for support, the sharp exhale he tried to disguise as a cough. People around him glanced, whispered, some knowingly, some in awe. The room's energy had shifted completely. My father's entitlement, so carefully maintained for decades, now hung exposed, a fragile facade shattered by truth. I felt a swell of something fierce and steady, vindication, yes, but also relief. Not just for myself, but for the quiet acknowledgement that Ethan's worth had never been measured by anyone else's approval. And as I watched him deliver the speech with effortless poise, I realized the public shift in power was absolute. What my father had tried to control through wealth, reputation, and influence now belonged to no one, and certainly not to him. After the gala, the night didn't simply end. It transformed into a confrontation that would define the next chapter of our lives. My father cornered Ethan privately, a storm barely contained behind his perfectly curated facade. "We can work together," he said, voice tight with the last remnants of control, merge resources, combine influence. Ethan shook his head slowly, calm and unyielding. "No," he said simply, the word carrying more weight than any argument my father could muster. "We will not partner. This project, this company, stands on its own terms. I will not compromise that." I watched from a short distance, heart hammering, as I saw the foundation of my father's carefully built empire tremble. His hand brushed the edge of the podium he had leaned on, gripping it almost desperately, eyes darting around for some lifeline. But there was none. The room, still buzzing from Ethan's announcement, felt like a silent jury passing judgment. Deals my father had been counting on began to collapse almost immediately, whispers on phones, polite refusals, subtle shifts in commitments. Each collapsed agreement was a small crack, visible only to those who knew the stakes, yet devastating in its implications. The fallout spread faster than I could process. In the following days, news circulated quietly among mutual contacts in finance and real estate. Reputations shifted like tectonic plates. My father, once untouchable in his social and business circles, now had to navigate a landscape where trust had eroded, and every handshake carried caution. Then came the personal fallout. My brother reached out, hesitant at first, his messages tentative and laced with guilt. I wanted to say I'm sorry," he wrote, his attempts to reconnect awkward, almost pleading. I read the words carefully, feeling the weight of the months he had spent mocking my modest living situation online. I didn't respond. Ethan stood behind me, quiet but firm, and I realized that forgiveness, if it came at all, would be on my terms, not his. My mother's attempts were more insidious. She presented herself as supportive, feigning concern, while I quietly discovered proof that she had been complicit with my father in undermining me, siding with him at every juncture. I confronted her with evidence, emails, financial documents, even small social media nudges that revealed her true alignment. Her eyes flickered with guilt and something else, surprise, perhaps, that I had noticed. I set my boundaries clearly, calmly, without rage, but with absolute finality. My trust would no longer be given freely, nor would she have influence over our lives. Throughout all this, Ethan remained my anchor. There were moments when I wanted to spiral, anger at my father, grief over lost family connection, the sting of public humiliation, but his presence reminded me that stability was possible, and that power could exist without entitlement. He had taken the public moment and reinforced it privately, creating a buffer that let me witness the fall of control without being consumed by it. By the end of that week, I realized something profound. My father's destabilization, the deals falling through, the social ripples spreading outward, it was complete. Not violent, not vindictive, but absolute. The narrative that had been dictated for me, my life as a pawn in a family obsessed with wealth and appearances, had been irrevocably rewritten. And I was no longer the observer. I was an active participant, alongside the man who had quietly, deliberately, shifted the balance of power entirely. Weeks after the fallout had fully settled, there was a knock at our apartment door, modest, brick-lined, warm from the late afternoon sun, nothing like the pristine marble corridors I had grown up in. I opened it to find my father standing there, suit slightly rumpled, shoulders slumped, eyes searching. He looked smaller than I remembered, not the unshakable man who once dictated every aspect of my life. For a moment, I just stared, listening to the quiet hum of the city outside, feeling the weight of everything that had passed. I made mistakes, he said, voice low, hesitant. There was no posturing, no charm, no lecture, only the raw, unguarded admission of a man who had finally seen his own arrogance and miscalculations. The complexity of emotion in that moment nearly unseated me. Anger, lingering hurt, the strange flicker of relief that he had come on his own. I let him speak, silently noting the contrast between this humbled figure and the commanding presence he'd carried at every gala, every meeting, every family dinner. I didn't rush to forgive him. Forgiveness had to be measured, deliberate. You have to understand, I said slowly, if there's to be any part of this, it will only be on my terms. He nodded, a quiet acknowledgement that for once I held the power and he would abide. There was no grand reconciliation, just an acceptance that our relationship had shifted irreversibly. In the year that followed, Meridian Creative grew steadily, confidently, independently. I watched it expand into a team of talented, driven people who respected our work, not the name behind it. Each contract, each successful campaign was a reaffirmation that worth could be earned, not inherited. The financial independence, the professional respect, the daily rhythm of life built from our own labor, it was intoxicating in a way wealth alone never had been. When I looked back at that first knock at the door, I realized the emotional dominance of the past year didn't come from revenge or triumph over my father. It came from the undeniable fact that we had rewritten our story, not as pawns in someone else's design, but as architects of our own. My father, humbled, admitted his errors, but the control was no longer his, it was ours. We had created a life anchored in respect, trust, and shared purpose, and it felt unshakable. Now, when I walk through our office, when I answer calls and lead strategy meetings, I feel the permanence of that shift. We're no longer living under the shadow of entitlement or expectation. The victories aren't loud, they're tangible, quiet, and ours. And even when I think of my father, there's a clarity in knowing forgiveness has its boundaries, and that respect, support, and love can coexist with firm lines. Thank you for staying until the very end. It means more than you know. If you've enjoyed seeing this journey unfold, make sure to like and subscribe, and check out another story in the description.